I feel like we have enough that counts as like a reasonable starting point. So let's get rolling and welcome everyone to this Placer AI webinar, Grocery Update, Opportunities and Challenges. This is a topic that we are have a particular affinity for and we love, and I think it's one of the more complex and far-reaching spaces within the wider retail environment, just in terms of when groceries up, it very often has wider implications. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start with a very quick introduction to Placer for those of you who are new, to get a sense of the types of data that is forming these opinions going to be in the backdrop of the conversation. We're then going to look at a status update. We're going to kind of analyze where the sector is, what we're seeing, how to make sense of it all. And then we're going to look at the trends, what is carrying, what might not carry, and what we think is going to impact the space moving forward. And as always, we will end with a Q&A. If you have a question at any point throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have Zoom configured, and we will try to get to as many as possible. I am thrilled to be joined today by two amazing guests that it only took me a very lot of convincing to get them to join. Carrie Smith, Managing Director of Franklin Street. Carrie, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
And Jennifer Bartasius, Senior Equity Research Analyst, Staples and Retail at Bloomberg Intelligence. Jennifer, thank you for joining.
I'm so happy to be here.
So a quick introduction to Placer, and again, what is the data you're going to be seeing in the backdrop of this conversation? Placer is a location data company in its simplest form. What does that mean? People vote with their feet, and we are showing you how they vote across the country to retail locations every day. We do that by observing a panel of over 30 million devices throughout the country. We then utilize AI and machine learning algorithms on top of that panel to make estimations on visits to retail locations across the country. Very critically, this is all anonymized aggregate data, so we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then take all that data and we show it in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from true trade areas, the customer journey, voids, traffic routes, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested, we have a free version of our product at placer.ai. We also have a section called The Square at placer.ai-the Square, where you can test out a bunch of our free tools and see what you think about location data. But now into the reason we are all here, the content itself. And I want to start with Jennifer here. What we are seeing is this extended wave of success with grocery. And we kind of had the excuse for it early on. There's this, stock up shopping. And then it was, well, it's essential retail, so that's why it's succeeding. But then it's just kind of continued to succeed. What is driving the strength and how long do you think it can last?
Oh, so there's actually a couple of things that are driving it. I mean, first, there is a continued strength in eating at home. A lot of people are heading back to the office, but it's not necessarily full time. So there are still many more instances of people eating at home than there were prior to the pandemic. So that is obviously built into kind of our expectations going forward, that for the next, probably year or so, that's going to really continue, and that eat at home strength. During the pandemic, people learned new skills. They learned to cook. They actually started to enjoy spending time with families around the dinner table. And so, that comfort level and that engagement has been there. But most importantly, on the side of the grocers, they have put lots of investment into improving the perimeter of the store, making the fresh areas more compelling, bringing people in and making them excited about what's on offer. And that goes a long way to helping to keep that runway for going, for success for these retailers.
That's such a great point, and how important that kind of perimeter is in terms of driving this kind of more extended and exciting experience. Carrie, I think one of the things that we can talk about a lot is how significant grocery is for so many shopping centers across the country. From your perspective, how has this ongoing strength reinforced that kind of unique anchor role that the grocery store plays within so many strip centers?
Yeah, so like Jennifer brings up some great points, and I like to refer to the grocery business, the supermarket business, as the essential business. I mean, if you think about it, Ethan, this business can last a pandemic, it can survive a natural disaster, it can survive a recession. This type of retailer is so ingrained in the natural fabric of our everyday lives that it's hard to see a path where it wouldn't be one of the strongest type of performing businesses within the shopping center industry. I mean, you think about it, you've got once a week shoppers, you got several times a week shoppers, you've got the bulk buying shoppers. And let's face it, most of us are probably a combination of all of those things. And what does that translate in the shopping center industry and for developers and owners? That's a nearly risk-proof asset that folks can look at from time and time again as continued dividends as time goes on. So while Jennifer makes some amazing points in terms of how they've been able to like modify post-pandemic, I think the future of the grocery store has several different factors that impact them being way beyond just a year of being successful, 10 years, 20 years beyond.
No, I think it's such an important point, and you touch on something that I think we don't come to terms with enough, which is that this sector is built into the fabric of our everyday lives in a way that others aren't. And so we can talk about, we speak about retail as this kind of homogenous whole, but it's not that. And grocery is really unique in the level of, you have your grocery store and there's a connection there that matters. And I know it's not as tangible, but it doesn't make it any less significant. But even considering the strength that you mentioned, I mean, this hasn't been a banner year in terms of challenges. Like, we kicked off with Omicron, then there was, rising gas prices. We have continued inflation. It's kind of been this, symphony of difficulties almost. And yet we have seen success. However, among these challenges, is there one, and Carrie, I'll start with you here, is there one that worries you most?
I mean, the supply chain issue worries me the most from a short-term play, but like how that impacts us over the next 6, 12, even 18 months. I mean, if you go to your everyday supermarket, the shelves aren't fully stocked like we're used to seeing 2 or 3 years ago. And that surely is going to play a part in, consumers continuing to go to their same store time and time again. Price increases, no question, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the program, but anytime you see major price increases like we are experiencing, it's not a simple bump, like it's a pretty significant increase for your everyday consumer. They're going to start changing the patterns and how and where they shop. And so how that impacts the supermarket that's in your neighborhood, I think will be interesting to watch over the next few months and into next year.
It's a really interesting point. I always turn to gas prices as the one that I'm like, the most, but you're right, supply chain, because it creates a disappointment. If the product isn't there, or the product is dramatically overpriced as a result, that does create this element of, I'm now no longer happy with the experience that I've had, as opposed to, all right, I accept the fact that I'm going to handle this extra cost in order to get there. But Jennifer, I think what's interesting for me from your perspective is that you're kind of trying to analyze all these companies. What kind of balance do you give? How do you contextualize these challenges when trying to understand their performance?
Yeah, I think this is a really great topical point, and kind of tailing on to what Carrie was saying. Supply chain is obviously a huge issue that these companies are dealing with, but I think one of the things that we haven't touched on enough is labor, and the cost of labor has gone up so much. And these retailers, do have to absorb that. It's a very low margin business, right? But at the same time, there's nothing that's more service oriented than a grocery store. So there's a really big dynamic of being able to provide great customer service, and at a time when your labor costs are rising and the temptation is to cut your labor force to contain that cost, but still delivering on that promise of great customer service, because as a local merchant, you want to be able to serve your community. And so like when I look at, analyzing these companies on a more big picture scale, it's what are the things that are the costs, and how do they keep costs down in ways that don't impact customers? And so the supply chain, yes, they're looking for efficiencies in the supply chain. Inventories are up. I mean, if you heard any news about Target in the last month, what inventory is a hot button right now in retail. So, finding ways to manage those costs, but still deliver on that promise of service is really, to me, the secret for success for these grocers right now.
It's such a great point. And it's the next, we're focused on kind of now the Targets and on the Walmarts. And I do think your point is so important, especially considering this wider Target discussion. I mean, just a few weeks ago, let alone merchandising issues and having overstock. I mean, we were hearing that Target's margins were down because they're swallowing some of the costs of inflation and of the supply chain and not passing it on to their customer. And we were, there was a lot of sentiment like, uh-oh, is that a good thing? And there is this element of like, of course it's a good thing. It's from a long-term perspective, it's probably a great thing for Target. And I think this idea that retailers are going to embrace some challenges in order to deepen their relationship with customers is so significant. But I think the other element of this, especially as it relates to the grocery sector, is Target, Walmart are an increasingly important piece of the grocery picture, especially when we think about rising gas prices and I want to make fewer stops. What's a place I can get more done? And Jennifer, I'll start with you here. I mean, how big of a threat are kind of superstores like Target and Walmart and their grocery sections to the wider grocery sector?
Well, if you think about it, and you think about if you take the typical products you would buy in a supermarket, more than 50% of Walmart's revenue comes from those products, right? So they are already a huge grocery player, and that they have been for a long time. With Target's always had a very different approach to grocery, where they've never aspired to be an actual replacement for the grocery shop. They've really viewed grocery as more of an enhancement to a trip that people are already making to their stores. So it's you don't necessarily go to Target to grocery shop, but you buy groceries or grocery items when you are there, which is a slightly different mindset. So these companies are, they're significant and they're meaningful in terms of grocery, but the benefits they have, are what you touched on. The fact that you can do one-stop shopping, that they, because of the size they are, the scale that they have, they can be very price competitive, at least on Walmart's perspective. And with Target, they've taken again, a slightly different track where they're focused on assortment and providing something that's unique and something that will resonate specifically with their customers. So you've seen this assortment skew more to maybe natural and organic, or healthy alternatives, or things that are more kid friendly. So you've seen them kind of tailor that assortment. But you can't understate the impact that they have on grocery. It's a matter of understanding who your core customer is and what they need out of your assortment and what their expectations are, and then how you deliver against that understanding.
That's a fantastic point, and I think that especially Target in the health space. Carrie, from your perspective, from looking at kind of the traditional grocery store, what do you think they can do to establish their kind of unique differentiation, their unique kind of strength when you compare them to superstores?
So I think what they do well is best in class customer service and providing unique product offerings. I mean, when you look at the supermarkets in your neighborhood and the ones that we'll look at through this presentation that have been successful, all of them, almost all overwhelming, have their private label brands, and us consumers have come to view those brands as better than just your natural product. I mean, you look at HEB out in Texas, they've got these like Texas shaped tortilla chips that Texans fall all over. Here in Florida, you hear us talk about Publix subs all the time, but let's not get lost. The Publix branded pasta, like you name it, like we're loyal to that. And Trader Joe's, who arguably is kind of the hallmark of their private label brand, the stuff that you can get in their stores, you can't find anywhere else. I mean, I'm personally obsessed with many of them, including chocolate covered bananas. And if you haven't had that, you should try it because they're amazing. But the superstores really haven't been able to expand upon that as much. Do they have their own private label brand? Sure. But is it as popular as the supermarket's been able to do? Not nearly as much. And then in terms of customer service, I mean, the brands that we think of as, loyalty and like trust is, Publix, HEB, Wegmans, Trader Joe's. You don't hear, no offense, but Walmart at the top of that list. And it's because of the experience that consumers get when they go to these stores. So yes, I mean, labor shortage is an issue, Jennifer, you're right, because these brands, they pride themselves on their customer service. Let's face it, they're in the customer service business. And so when that starts getting impacted, it could be a real problem for them.
That's really interesting. Jennifer, I want your take on this too, because we had a question come in on specifically what Carrie was just discussing, which is the impact of private labels. And the question was, what do you think the impact of private label will be in an elongated downturn of the economy?
Yeah, so historically speaking, when the economy turns, private label sales do tend to rise. And that's because there's usually what we call a flight to value, where people will increasingly seek value. What's a little bit different these days is that the bands of private label have really evolved. When I was a kid, and I'm going to date myself here, like in the 70s, it was generic. It was the white box with the black, stencil letters, and it was just said, pasta. You didn't even know what was in it. It just said pasta. Things have really evolved. And so most stores now have like 3 tiers. They have kind of that entry level, which is the bottom value dollar, like the cheapest you can get to really preserve money. They kind of have a standard store brand, and then they all mostly have some kind of premium line as well. And so when we're talking about a downturn, we see people shift into kind of that more medium band of private label, and some certainly into the lower band. We track daily, we track monthly sales data that we get from IRI that tells us where things are across the store. And right now, we've only just started to see an acceleration in private label sales. So it had been holding strong for a while, but that slightly started to turn in April and turned a little bit more in May. And so we think that as the year continues, we're going to see that shift continue to accelerate into private label as budgets continue to sort of be pressured through inflation and gas prices and rising rents and all of the things that consumers are facing right now.
Very interesting. And to Carrie's point, especially when those private label brands, there's an affinity for them, in some cases, a very strong affinity. Carrie, I'll go to you with this one. When we think about kind of grocery winners, we think about the Publixes of the world, HEBs. I mean, the Trader Joe's to me was the shock of the pandemic, how incredibly well they did, especially when someone not so smart, me, predicted that they were going to do really bad. Do you see a common thread? Do these winners have something in common? And what do you think the wider takeaway is for the grocery space?
I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're already talking about. I mean, it's the customer experience that the consumer has come to know and love at these brands. I mean, when you walk into a Trader Joe's, by way of example, you're walking into an experience. And not only is someone coming to help you find something, but they're also suggesting things that you may not know that you needed, right? So like pushing products as part of their business, but making it where it feels like, oh, you're coming home, so to speak. When you go into your neighborhood supermarket, the one that's just a mile or two away from you, you know who your deli guy is, you know who your baker is. And in all likelihood, if they're doing a good job, you probably know who the manager of the store is as well. I also think these guys, I'll specifically point out like Publix, Albertsons, HEB, Safeway, they've done a good job in positioning themselves within the neighborhoods. Like they're really capturing the audience to making it convenient to where you live or where you work, depending on what the play is at the time. But they're making it easy for consumers to stop by, even when we have high price times right now and labor shortages. So like you may think like, let's go the extra mile and go to Walmart or Target, wherever it may be. But when Publix is a bike ride away or a mile away, that can impact your decision making as well.
It's such a good point. I also think it's that, and this kind of goes back to the point of what can a Publix do against a Target. And I'm about as big of a Target fan as it comes. They understand their local audience because they're a regional player. There's an ability to be much more hyper focused on local experiences, and I think those who really invest in that see a tremendous amount of success. I mean, Jennifer, for you, are there particular grocery chains that have stood out in a positive way in the last 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, some of the ones that Carrie has already touched on are ones that seem to always rise to the top when you talk about Publix, HEB, Trader Joe's. These are chains that truly understand their constituents, right? I will say that part of it is also that these are the guys who have figured out how to organize their stores in ways that make sense and are easy for customers. Right. So part of why Trader Joe's did so well in the early parts of the pandemic, not only because people like their products, but it's a small store. You can get in and out. You don't have to spend a lot of time around other people. You can just be quick and do it fast. In a more traditional size grocery store, the grab and go sections that are up close to the front of the store. And then you need a last minute, dinner solution. They've done a really good job of figuring out how to balance the consumer's needs for diversity in products, local assortment that resonates, but also convenience. And that balance is really what helps these these regional chains be very noticeable and well loved by the people who have them in their communities.
Yeah, it's an amazing point and really important. Before we get to the kind of the next section, I want to address some of the questions that came in. So first, we've had a couple about Aldi. We're getting there, I promise. But one came in that says, what has been the impact of basket size as fuel costs are driving less trips, grocery versus superstore or club? I'll kick off a little bit by, we did see a big shock to this system when gas prices were rising in March, but then we saw that start to level out. We haven't seen a dramatic change, but there are clearly impacts. Kara, I'll start with you. How do you perceive this kind of specific impact of rising gas prices within the grocery space?
Well, it's not just rising gas prices, it's inflation. It's like, people are very much locally impacted by many factors that the economy is hitting us. But, to my point is being, I think there's a bigger drive to the private label brands. I think there's a bigger drive to look like at what you're spending your dollars on. How Walmart, I should say maybe Walmart, more Target, is impacted by this would be interesting, because you go to Target to buy one thing, but you walk out buying 20. I mean, that's what they're known for and what they love. That to me is impactful to them. Like, you start changing your mind. You're like, no, maybe I don't need that tank top in addition to all these groceries. So like, I think that's probably the bigger implication that we'll see. But in terms of like what you're buying for your family, there's not going to be a whole lot of change in that, because like I say, I go back to like, groceries is your essential way of life. It's, birthday parties, you need groceries. Vacations, you need groceries. At dinner, you need groceries. So like, this isn't going away.
And it's still the most cost-effective kind of channel.
Absolutely.
I think that, I mean, that's what kind of, even in this environment, they're still well positioned. Jennifer, I want to go with you to a different question that came in.
Yeah.
Why do you think Walmart stopped growing the neighborhood market concept?
Yeah, it's a good question. They did at one point have a nice push on kind of the smaller format stores, and I think when it came down to it, the power of Walmart lies in its larger assortment, and it's having the general merchandise, and not being just a pure grocery. And that's really what the neighborhood markets were. It was a 40,000 square foot box, pure grocery. It's a lot harder to keep that profitable. And absorb that into the greater organization. And I think that for Walmart's perspective, they decided to focus on a couple of things. One is the online grocery and the offering, and really making that as good as it can be. So they were one of the early adopters of curbside pickup, and testing that out and building the technology around it. And having that ability to order online. So I think the priorities just kind of shifted in looking at where is grocery going and the technology side of things, as opposed to becoming profitable in a small format box.
I want to get to one more before we continue on. And we had a question come in from Anne that said, what do you see happening to premium, natural, and organic brands in the upcoming months? Are higher income shoppers or value-based consumers switching and trading down? Jennifer, I'll start with you here, because a really interesting thing that we have seen is that the percentage of cross-shopping between Target and some of these more higher end, organic, fresh-oriented grocers has been increasing. So I wonder if that kind of point that you mentioned earlier of Target starting to focus in is starting to eat away a little bit at that. Do you think there's going to be a trade down from this, or is this a more philosophical, emotional choice too?
Well, I think there's a little bit of both, honestly. I mean, when you think about people who have adopted a natural and organic lifestyle are not going to necessarily abandon those products. They're going to be seeking those products at the best value that they can get them, right? So if you give your kids organic milk, you're not really, that'll probably be one of the last things you try to swap out of, but you'll look for the lowest price organic milk that you can find. And so I think that there's some flexibility there in terms of that. People who are kind of half-hearted, as I would call it, organic and natural advocates, meaning if you're in the store and you're looking at two products and they're right next to each other and the price is like very similar, okay, I'll take the organic one. those are the customers that may change their behaviors. But for the true believers, is what I like to call them, I don't think you'll see that happen. And right now in the higher income households, the spending patterns seem to be holding steady. So it really comes down to how long will it take? And frankly, for the high income households, it's really about how the stock market performs, right? Because they have money to spend, but they get nervous when the stock market gets too tight, because they worry about the future. So it's a little early to see yet for the rest of the year how that's going to play out. But those are kind of the big things that impact that higher end consumer.
A really important point, and I will leave aside the fact that I think you called out my personal relationship with organic foods. But Carrie, I want to start with you here. I think one of the big trends that we've been talking about quite a bit is this kind of suburban shift. And again, are we seeing urban areas start to come back in a really significant way? Absolutely. But even if there was a balance found, there was clearly a new audience that's coming into the suburbs, and that audience comes with a real potential that it adds to kind of the suburban mix. Do you expect the shifts in focus among grocery retailers? Do you expect to see them try to aim for, higher income people who have now moved out of the city, maybe have disposable income? How do you see suburban strategy changing? And the flip side of that, how do you see urban grocery strategies changing if we see these audiences start flipping?
So the answer to that is not necessarily. I don't see this major shift from grocers focused on urban infill locations to suburban. And, my where we see the most real estate deals, my vantage point is in the Southeast and primarily in Florida. And you've got deals being done in downtown. You've got deals being done in the suburbs. What I think will be interesting to watch over the next, I'll call it 12 to 24 months is, you go into an urban infill location because you've got this live, work, play environment. And if you take one of those factors away, i.e. work, or you at least limit it, how does that impact the grocery store's decision to do deals down there? But the reality is, Ethan, there's several deals that the grocery stores are doing in our urban areas, in our community centers right now that were done and started to be done before the pandemic. And given all their numbers were just like high, they continued with those deals. So these stores are about to open. And it's going to be very interesting to watch how the opening of a Publix in downtown Jacksonville, there's one right here in San Marco, is going to compare to the Publix that's opening in a St. Johns County type of scenario. But we don't anticipate there being this flight, so to speak, into the suburbs. The supermarket has always catered to the suburb and has done a good job. What they've been doing for the last 10 years is being a bigger, better player for the urban infill locations and right-sizing themselves and figuring out how to build themselves within the urban centers, within our downtowns. And we have this whole generation coming out of college right now, Generation Z, and I can tell you those kids aren't moving to the suburbs. Those kids, any apartment developer will tell you, those kids are moving to downtown. And the supermarkets are following that and seeing that, and they want to be part of their lives at the front end of their work careers. So I don't see this major shift. I thought the data that y'all provided was pretty interesting, but I think we're on the beginning of finding out if there would be a major shift. And I'm not buying that.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that many of those coming to the cities, this younger audience, there's some really interesting research from Bloomberg and from kind of Urban Digs, who focuses on the New York market specifically, on showing some of that information that we do have this younger audience coming in, and they already started coming in almost a year ago.
Yeah.
But there is this element, and you touched on it, and Jennifer, I'd love to hear your take on this, that grocery stores were built for the suburbs. And so any shift that we do see, and again, even if it's a small but significant shift of that 35-plus-year-old who has a handful of kids, is moving out to the suburbs, has this first-time demand, maybe lower food costs because it's a suburban environment as opposed to an urban environment, a bigger pantry to put all that food. This does seem like uniquely well set up for groceries to thrive. How do you think they can capitalize on this?
Yeah, and there are a couple of things there. You're talking about kind of that older millennial cohort that have kids, and there is a little bit of that flight to the suburbs happening, but that's not necessarily different. I think if you're in a city and you have two kids, all of a sudden the economics of it make you start thinking generally, okay, we need space, we need grass, we need whatever. But for the supermarkets, there's a couple of things there. The first is, grocery stores, because they're so local, have really done a great job of cultivating the sense of community, where they give back to local charities. They sponsor local sports teams of the schools. They are the first responders when there's some kind of natural disaster or emergency. You see the grocery stores out there, and they play a very critical role. And so building on that track record, I think, is an opportunity for them, as we see people coming out of the suburbs. And as Carrie mentioned, in terms of just what you can carry, the bulk size, products, things that are easier to deal with a car than if you're walking in the city or have to have something delivered. That's there as well. And I think that in terms of the urban stores, the smaller footprints, where the opportunity lies there is in the integration of technology and shopping together. And if you have younger cohorts who are moving into the cities, they're savvy in terms of technology. They have different expectations in terms of how long things should take, whether they should have to carry things, whether they should be delivered, what those expectations are. And those smaller stores are very well positioned to start delivering on that future promise. So for some retailers, those can be great experimental type locations, to then find good learnings and then bring them back to the suburbs as well. And then everyone benefits from some of that investment.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really amazing technological shifts that are enabling that, everything from micro fulfillment, kind of this Amazon Go as a service technologies that we're seeing. One of the big ones that gets me, has gotten us very excited for a while now, and I think with recent kind of news from like Albertsons and others, where we're going even crazier about it, is this idea of kind of retail footprint, large scale locations and branches as a media network and what that provides. And Kara, I want to start with you here. I think viewing the store as more than just sales per square foot is a trend that we've been seeing for a little while now, of retailers trying to get this better understanding of how they can leverage their locations in a more effective way. And one big element of that has been this, hey, what's the marketing value? What's the advertising value of my store? How significant do you think this trend is?
Well, I think we're at the beginning of figuring this out, but it's interesting that you guys bring up Albertsons. So let's think through Albertsons. They've got this Just for You loyalty program. Once you sign up for this program, they're going to provide you information on your birthday. They're going to give you personalized meal suggestions. They're going to know when you're shopping at the store. They're going to know what you're buying at the store. So having this data set to provide not only for themselves, but maybe potentially for third parties, like suppliers that they have providing food and services or whatnot within their stores, I think it'd be very, very powerful in terms of an additional revenue stream. I go back to your supermarket, it's a very loyal, local, loyal type of business that you and I are going to on a regular basis. But once they start tapping into the power of how often we're going, what we're buying, who we're shopping for, I mean, that could be a very, very lucrative type of data that not only themselves are going to utilize, but like I said, the suppliers and the food chain people that are buying within their store.
It's such a great point. But if you think about how even the CPG company operates from this clustering basis of how do we focus which products we place in which stores and which amounts so as to reach the right audience, it's the same process that you would view advertising, and you can get really focused on how do you reach certain audiences within that kind of retail network. Jennifer, do you think we need to adjust the way we view grocery chains to account for these other potential revenue streams, other potential opportunities?
Yeah, I do think that we need to expand our understanding and definition of what a grocery store is. Because it's no longer just a bricks and mortar place where people go to buy food. And Kroger is a great example of this, just because they've been at the forefront for a long time of talking about alternative revenue streams. And it's taken them a long time to get investors to understand why it's important and why they should believe that grocers like Kroger are capable of executing on something that's not traditionally a historic strength. You don't normally think of Albertsons or Kroger as an advertising type agency, but the value that they have in all of the loyalty data that Carrie referenced, like with Just for You, with Albertsons, and Kroger's loyalty program, is of huge value. And so they've really, I think they've built up teams in order to take advantage of that. And you have to remember, when you think about CPG companies, there's not an easy way for them to get data firsthand, because people don't go to generalmills.com to buy cereal. They go to the grocery store to buy cereal, right? And so it's very difficult for these CPG companies to get that kind of granular data on their own. And so it's a natural marriage between the people who produce the food products and the people who sell the food products to come together in these retail media networks. And so I just see that this is going to be something that has a long runway for growth. And can really help both sides of the equation, because those CPG companies can target new innovations, new products, getting the assortment right, and the retailers can benefit because they're getting new and different items into baskets of people who shop there and are offering their customers value, and that keeps them loyal.
Absolutely, and there's ways to get so nuanced. I mean, one of our favorite things that we started with was we partner with a company called Spatial AI that does kind of web search and social demographics data. And you're able to layer that on top and understand really significant differences between areas that have very similar demographic breakdowns. So that those added nuances are really empowering companies to think differently about where they want to be and what they can accomplish by being there. I want to, I mean, you know what, let's get to this one because this will actually answer some of the questions, but it's time to talk about a company we never talk about, Amazon. And Carrie, I'll start with you here, and I'm going to go to the same question with both of you. And then, what do you think Amazon's future in grocery looks like, and how much do you think it matters for the wider sector?
So I think the Amazon factor matters a whole lot. They have proven themselves to be a disruptor in many different industries. But in this particular sector, I think it matters. And the reason why is because of the data that they've already been collecting on their consumers for years. I mean, we're talking decades now. And they know what we're buying not only on their website, but man, if you've got Alexa in your house, they probably know when you ran out of something. So I think what they're going to be able to do is capitalize on the data that they've already gotten. In addition to that, they've got Whole Foods as a test model. So, you know, they took over Whole Foods. Now they're testing, like, what is the grocery shopper business like? Are people getting delivery plus they're coming into the store? And I think with the whole Amazon Fresh model that's been rolled out in major metropolitan markets, you're going to start to see these in the suburbs. You're going to start to see these in second tier markets because they realize that they've got to have this brick and mortar presence to also capitalize on the Amazon Go, right? So what for me, like, no, we don't have a crystal ball in the real estate world, but I think it's going to be a disruptor. And I think the disruption comes from the data, and the grocery stores to me are just on the cusp of understanding how important that information is and creating these loyalty programs that, let's face it, historically they've not had to have. You were loyal anyways, right? But now they need that information to understand if and when the ebb and flow of the grocery store shopper is coming to their store or somewhere else. I think it's going to be pretty powerful. And as a person who's like loves efficiency and convenience, I can't wait to see. Is it scary to a certain extent that they know what I need before I need it? Sure. But is it convenient? It's pretty convenient. I like it.
Great point. Jennifer, same question for you. What does Amazon's future in grocery look like, and how much does their presence in grocery matter for the wider sector?
So I'm going to actually take a counter stance to some of what Carrie said. So we'll get a little disagreement going here. I agree completely about the value of the data that Amazon has and the amount of data that they have. But I look at Amazon and grocery, and I look at that and I see that they like to play, but I don't see that they are serious. And I say that because they seem to like to use things for test cases, right? When Amazon Go came out, they said there were going to be 2,000 or 3,000 Amazon Go stores. We have less than 70 years later. Amazon Fresh, there's going to be thousands of stores or hundreds of stores. We have a handful of stores. They're labs where Amazon can test and can learn. They bought Whole Foods and have done nothing with Whole Foods in the time that they've had it, right? So, I think that when Amazon does something, the market reacts, retailers react, And that's actually not a bad thing, because it's made them all much better operators, right? Because of the threat and the scare of Amazon. But when you look at Amazon's actual execution and their actual follow through on the plans that they actually announce, it's not been a devastating track record. They introduce technology, they introduce convenience, they get people to think about things in different ways. But I have a hard time envisioning that there will be an Amazon Fresh store in a lot of neighborhoods 5 years from now. So that's, I think they play a valuable role, and I think that people always pay attention. But I just don't see them as being a fundamental displacer of existing retailers.
Jennifer, I
really-
hope you're right, because they're looking at several locations that I'd rather put one of my tenants in. So I hope we can look back a year from now. I was like, she got it.
So, what's interesting is I fall somewhere in between the two. And we had a question come in. What's your take on Amazon's push into grocery? Does the two-pronged approach with Amazon Fresh and Whole Foods have legs? I view it as a three-pronged approach, because I think Whole Foods doesn't make sense within the Amazon lane. Like, there's things that they've done really well, aligning it with Prime and some really smart things that they've helped push Whole Foods forward with. But Whole Foods is high end. Right, that was always supposed to be. It's not about convenience and quick. It's about a little bit more expensive and a little bit fancier. You'll spend more on the asparagus here because you trust the quality. Amazon Go felt very Amazon-y, in the middle of an urban environment, quick, get in, get out, showcase the technology, etc. I think Amazon Fresh is the wild card here, because if you look at what happens in California, who it's competing with, it's competing on a more value orientation. It's not competing with Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. It does feel like if we see Amazon push Amazon Fresh, I think they've figured out their mix. I am fascinated by this move equally. Sadly, no one's ever given me a crystal ball, but if I get one, I will let you all know. But that is the take on a very interesting question. And I think I want to make sure we get to this, because I think there will be an uproar if we don't. Let's talk about value. Let's talk about trading down. And if we can't talk about trading down, we have to talk about Aldi and Lidl, and we have to talk about these value-oriented chains. So Carrie, I'll start with you here. And whether it be the growth from kind of Aldi, Lidl, or even like a grocery outlet, value is clearly is all the rage right now, and will likely continue to play a significant role over the next year, 18 months. How do you see this shift, this focus on value, impacting the wider grocery space?
Yeah, so those of us in the shopping center space know that consumers don't just shop at one grocery store. They probably shop at 5 in any given week, in any given month. And I think with Aldi and Lidl coming into the market when they've come in, because they really made a strong push real estate wise, I'll call it like 8-10 years ago, they positioned themselves to be in great pieces of real estate right before a pandemic hit, and then right before we had several economic measures that's causing consumers to pause on their normal grocery habits. So what this means for them is like they're probably tapping into a customer base that hadn't tried that before. Yes, we were shopping at the Kroger, and then we were going to Walmart, and then maybe we were going to Target, but were we going to the Aldi that just opened up right around the corner? I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. But now, are people trying it? Absolutely. And I think that they have done a fantastic job from a real estate rollout perspective and positioning themselves similar to the supermarkets that you're used to seeing. So like they're not shying away from being down the street from Publix or being down the street from a Kroger or an Albertsons. They're going right next door to them because they know if and when the time comes, they're going to get that consumer in the door. And so what they can do now is they can capture that audience and try to keep them long term, right? So this is their moment to me. This is their moment to shine. Like you get the consumer in the store once, then maybe you've created a consumer for life. And that's what I think is cool about what they've done. And could they have anticipated some sort of pandemic or major economic indicators happening in 2022? No. But did they choose the right real estate and did they roll it out efficiently and do a good job? They did.
That's a great point. Jennifer, I'll kind of go to you with this one. What do you think the ceiling is for like the Aldi's, Lidl's, considering their current very aggressive expansion plan?
Actually, I don't really see a ceiling for them. I have to be honest, because as Carrie said, they've gotten very smart on their real estate. And in the last 5 years, if you had gone to an Aldi in the 80s, They were dark, they were dingy, they were nasty. They were like, you shop there because you had to, not because you wanted to. But Aldi has embarked on a huge, store refresh and refurbishment project. They look like normal grocery stores. They feel like normal grocery stores. I can tell you there's an Aldi about 1.5 miles from my house, and it is full of BMWs and Mercedes, right? Because people are like, hey, I can get this, or I can get organic avocados at Aldi. And so they've changed their product mix as well, where they have gluten-free, they have organic, they have things that traditionally you would never have thought belonged in a value retailer are there. And they're able to sell them at a high velocity. When you look at Lidl and Aldi, they're European-based retailers. They've accumulated huge market share in Europe. And all of that expertise and that learning is being applied now in the United States. So when I look at the long-term potential for these retailers, I can see that there's plenty of space for them to continue to open stores and to take market share away from some of the other players in the industry.
That's such an interesting point, especially on the kind of the European expertise, because classically, like Tesco, which is the king of grocery in the UK, wasn't able to make that transition, even though, I lived in London for a year. Tesco is incredible. I mean, there. Sadly, we don't have enough time for all the content, but this was such a brilliant conversation. And Jennifer, Carrie, both, thank you so much for joining. This was, I mean, not that I expected any less, but this was unbelievably fun. I really appreciate you joining, sharing your expertise and insights. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it as always. Look out, we have our next webinar coming in just a few weeks. We're going to be focusing on specifically urban retail and what to expect from that segment. We're going to have another one in early July that's going to kind of look at retail at the halfway point. So thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer, Carrie, thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Have a great rest of the day.